The North Devon Biosphere is a UNESCO designation, so that's United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, and they have a science programme called Man in the Biosphere, which is about testing approaches and research into sustainable development. So our Biosphere Reserve extends from the top of Dartmoor, the top of Exmoor, and it comes all the land that drains to the North Devon coast and then goes 12 miles beyond Lundy. So it is really a big experimental area that works and sort of is the living laboratory of that science programme. So biosphere reserves have three zones. When they're established, they have a core, a buffer and a transition. But Braunton Burrows remained as the core area of the biosphere reserve. So it's a pretty large site. It's about 1,400 hectares. Much of the very early research on how dunes form, how they change, etc. was done at Braunton Burrows. So it's got very much a strong culture and history in our knowledge of the environment. So with the floristic diversity and the insect diversity that's there, it does put it in that top set of dune systems in Europe. Within dunes themselves, they are supposed to be sort of quite dynamic places, but historically management has sort of made them much more static, and they just get fixed. But dunes typically go through what they call a succession, called a samosir, and you start off with the beach, and then you get the strand line. And that can be strand line debris, and that traps sand, and then that sort of builds up a little bit, and it gets just a little bit higher than the high spring tides, and then it starts being colonised by vegetation, things like sea rocket and that sort of thing. And then that sort of vegetation traps more sand, and then it builds up again, and then you get things like marram grass, which again traps more sand and builds up. So you get this sort of gradation from beach through to embryo dunes, primary dunes, and then you get sort of dips and hollows behind, which are the slacks, and then you get secondary dunes. And as you go back and back towards the land, the dunes are older and older, so they're getting more and more fixed in time. And so ultimately by the time you get to the back of the dunes, you would have dune woodland as your final and ultimate expression of that succession. But then you have all these sort of small kind of microhabitats and dynamic processes going on. And a lot of the plants for which Braunton Burrows is famous for, like sand, toad, flax, etc. They're the ones that pioneer those early little exposed areas back in the dune turf. So it needs a little bit of constructive erosion and dynamics to keep those plants and those in that succession and keeps it turning over. So you want these areas to degrade and then rebuild themselves, and then other bits to degrade, so that those pioneers are actually then sort of working on other new fresh areas as well. So you're keeping this dynamic going all the time of sort of plants popping up, sand being worn away, eroded, new plants coming in, and then that pioneering succession continues on. So you just keep on turning the clock back in those little bits. And some people say, well, that's possibly gardening too much, but a lot of those dune dynamics would happen naturally. I think it's just the tools that we use to keep those dynamics are different. And the other thing that surprises people is actually the presence of the Ministry of Defence and their training has been a real benefit, and that has kept, if like, some of those plants going there at Braunton Burrows since the Second World War, because the philosophy of nature being a thing that you keep out of and separate from human processes was actually sort of the thing that was destroying the site, whereas the MOD being then sort of driving Land Rovers, etc., and creating open sand was the thing that was actually maintaining the site. So it's using those things in a constructive way, and that human use where you can actually say, well, that human intervention is maintaining the conservation and biodiversity of the site and not actually destroying it. But obviously there's a balance to be made.